Just his influences with Texas music and all the writers here, and he decided that
For decades, George Strait has been known as one of the most respected voices in country music. But behind that public image was a much quieter reality that most people never noticed. So, what exactly was happening behind the scenes for more than 3 decades? Join us as we take a closer look at the private life George Strait kept hidden while the world watched his legendary career. Quiet Texas Roots. George Strait was born on May 18, 1952, far from the bright lights and noise of the entertainment world. He entered life in the small South Texas town of Poteet, a place where people were known more for their hard work than for chasing fame. His early years were not shaped by studios, agents, or stage lights. They were shaped by open land, long days, and the kind of small-town life that taught people to stay grounded. That setting mattered. It gave Strait a strong connection to ordinary life, and that connection would stay with him long after he became one of the biggest names in country music. Much of his childhood was spent in nearby Pearsall, where his family worked a cattle farm. Life on a farm was not easy, and it did not leave much room for laziness. Daily routines were built around chores, responsibility, and the needs of the land and animals. Farm work demanded physical effort and consistency. It taught George early that some things simply had to be done, whether he felt like doing them or not. That kind of life helps shape a person in lasting ways. It teaches patience, discipline, and respect for work. It also creates a certain emotional steadiness. There is little room for drama in a life built around getting through the day and doing your share. His home life changed in an important way when his parents divorced during his childhood. After that, George and his brother were raised mainly by their father. That experience likely added another layer of seriousness to his early life. His father was a junior high school mathematics teacher, but he was also deeply involved in the practical demands of running the family farm. That meant George grew up watching a man who moved between two very different worlds: the structure of the classroom and the demands of rural labor. From that example, he likely learned that responsibility was not something you spoke about. It was something you lived every day. These early experiences helped form many of the qualities people would later notice in George Strait. He did not grow into a flashy public figure. He became known for humility, restraint, and a quiet kind of confidence. Even at the height of his fame, he never seemed hungry for attention in the way many celebrities do. That preference for privacy was not something created by stardom. It was already part of who he was. His work ethic was also deeply rooted in those early years. The discipline he learned as a boy would later show up in the consistency of his music career, his steady public image, and the way he carried himself through both success and heartbreak. Before George Strait became a country legend, he was a small-town Texas boy shaped by family, hardship, and hard work. And that quiet beginning explains more about him than fame ever could. And as he got older, those same roots would quietly lead him toward the music that changed everything. Discovering country music. Before George Strait became one of the most recognizable voices in country music, he was simply a young man trying to figure out what truly spoke to him. Long before fame, awards, and sold-out arenas, he was listening closely to the artists who defined traditional country music. Singers like Hank Williams, Merle Haggard, and George Jones left a deep impression on him. Their music was not complicated or flashy. It told honest stories about everyday life, love, pain, regret, and pride. That kind of music connected with Strait because it reflected the world he came from. These were songs about real people and real emotions, and that directness stayed with him. As a teenager, George did not begin by fully committing himself to country music. Like many young people in the late 1960s, he also explored other sounds. In high school, he played in a rock and roll garage band. That experience gave him an early chance to perform and understand how music felt when shared with other people. It also helped him see what fit him and what did not. While rock may have been popular and exciting, it did not match his personality in the same way country music did. Over time, he realized that traditional country felt more natural, more honest, and closer to his roots. It was the style that allowed him to express something real instead of simply following what was trendy. At that stage in life, however, music was still only one part of a much larger search for direction. After graduating from high school, George Strait did what many young people do when they are unsure of the future. He enrolled in college, but there was no clear plan yet. He had not fully mapped out a career, and success in music was still far from certain. He was not yet the confident star the world would later know. He was a young man standing between responsibility, adulthood, and the question of what kind of life he wanted to build. And before long, that quiet love for country music would follow him into a whole new chapter of life. The Army years. In the early 1970s, before anyone outside of Texas knew his name, George Strait took a path that would quietly shape the beginning of his music career. After high school, he enlisted in the United States Army. Like many young men at the time, he was stepping into adulthood while still figuring out where his life might lead. Military service introduced structure, responsibility, and discipline. Strait was eventually stationed in Hawaii, a long way from the cattle farms and small towns of South Texas, where he had grown up. While the Army was primarily about duty and service, it also gave Strait an unexpected opportunity to keep music in his life. During his time in Hawaii, he joined an Army-sponsored country band called Rambling Country. The group performed for fellow servicemen and local audiences, often playing at military events and small venues around the area. These performances were not glamorous. The crowds were modest, and the setting was far removed from the big stages of Nashville. But for Strait, these shows were extremely important. They allowed him to sing regularly, practice his craft, and experience what it felt like to perform in front of people who genuinely enjoyed the music. Playing Rambling Country marked the first time George Strait began to understand what life as a performer might be like. Standing on stage, even in small settings, helped him build confidence. He learned how to connect with an audience, how to carry himself during a performance, and how powerful simple country songs could be when delivered honestly. Those early shows were not about fame or recognition. They were all about experience. Each performance helped him grow more comfortable with the idea that music could be more than just something he enjoyed. It could become part of his future. When his military service ended later in the decade, Strait returned to Texas with a noticeably different outlook. He resumed his college education, but he was no longer the same young man who had left. The time away had given him maturity and a clearer sense of direction. Music was no longer just a personal interest. It had become something he wanted to pursue more seriously. Back in Texas, with new confidence and stronger musical instincts, George Strait began taking the first real steps toward a career that would soon change his life. Marriage before fame. Long before George Strait became a country music icon, one of the most important parts of his life was already firmly in place. That was his relationship with Norma Strait, the woman who would remain by his side through every stage of his journey. Their story began when they were young, in the familiar and quiet setting of small-town Texas. It was not a romance built around fame, ambition, or public attention. It grew out of shared history, closeness, and the kind of understanding that often comes from growing up in the same world. Their bond was formed early, before the pressures of celebrity ever had a chance to test it. In December 1971, George and Norma got married when he was just 19 years old. It was a simple beginning to a life they would build together over many decades. At that point, George was not a star. He was still a young man trying to find his direction, balancing responsibility, marriage, and the uncertainty of the future. That matters because their marriage was never built on the rewards of success. It existed before the record deals, the tours, and the public recognition. They started their life together when things were ordinary and, in many ways, difficult. That early foundation gave their relationship a strength that fame could not create. One of the most unusual things about their marriage was how private it remained. Norma never appeared eager to step into the spotlight, and George never tried to push her there. In an entertainment world where spouses are often drawn into public life, interviews, and media attention, Norma chose a different path. She stayed quiet and out of view, and George respected that choice. He did not treat her privacy as a problem to solve. He treated it as something worth protecting. That mutual understanding became one of the strongest parts of their relationship. It showed that their marriage was based on respect, not performance. Over time, Norma became more than George Strait's wife. She became his steady point in a life that would eventually become very demanding. Their marriage was grounded in shared values, trust, and loyalty. While his public life grew larger, his private life stayed centered on home. That gave George something many famous people struggle to keep: emotional balance. Through change, loss, and success, the marriage remained a constant source of strength. And as George's career slowly began to rise, that quiet partnership would become even more important. Fatherhood. Fatherhood came into George Strait's life long before fame did. In 1972, just a short time after marrying Norma, he became a father when their daughter Jennifer was born. That moment added a whole new level of responsibility to his life. He was still very young, still trying to understand his own future, and still far from the success that would later make him famous. But now he was not only thinking about himself. He had a wife, a child, and a growing family depending on him. That changed the way he had to approach life. At the time, George was balancing family responsibilities with military service, and the uncertainty that came with being a young man still finding his direction. Life was not glamorous or easy. There was no sign yet that he would one day become one of country music's biggest stars. Financial stability was limited, and like many young couples, George and Norma had to build their life step by step. He could not afford to chase dreams recklessly. He had to think about stability, income, and what kind of future he could provide. That pressure likely forced him to grow up quickly. Fatherhood often does that, and in George's case, it seems to have deepened the seriousness and quiet determination that were already part of his nature. As the 1970s went on and George began taking music more seriously, life became even more demanding. He drove long distances to perform at small venues, often playing bars, dance halls, and local spots for modest pay. These were not high-profile opportunities. They were hard-earned jobs that required time, patience, and sacrifice. The money was limited, the travel was tiring, and success was far from guaranteed. But he kept going. He was trying to build something while also carrying the responsibilities of being a husband and father. That balancing act was not easy, and it reveals just how much determination was behind his early music career. Throughout this period, Norma played an important role behind the scenes. She supported George's dream without drawing attention to herself. While he traveled, performed, and slowly worked toward something bigger, she helped maintain stability at home. That kind of support often goes unnoticed from the outside, but it can make all the difference. Their family life did not run on fame or comfort. It ran on trust, patience, and shared effort. And as his career finally started to move forward, the next chapter would bring both success and heartbreak. The rise of George Strait. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, George Strait was no longer just a hard-working Texas musician playing small venues and hoping for a break. After years of steady effort, he finally began pushing into the country music industry in a serious way. One of the biggest turning points came when he signed a recording contract and officially stepped into the Nashville world. That moment did not make him a star overnight, but it opened the door. His early singles began attracting attention because they sounded different from much of what was happening in country music at the time. There was something calm, confident, and familiar in his voice, and listeners responded to it. What made George stand out was not that he was trying to reinvent country music. In many ways, he was doing the opposite. At a time when some artists were moving toward a more polished and pop-influenced sound, Strait leaned into the traditional style he had loved from the beginning. His music was built on clear storytelling, real emotion, and straightforward country arrangements. He was not chasing trends. He was returning to the roots of the genre. That choice ended up giving him a powerful identity. Fans who missed the older style of country heard something genuine in his songs, and that honesty helped him connect with people very quickly. As his songs climbed the charts, George Strait's fan base began to grow fast. More people were coming to the shows, more records were selling, and his name was spreading well beyond Texas. What started as quiet momentum soon became a major rise. Over time, he earned a title that would stay with him for decades: the King of Country. That label did not come from flashy behavior or a loud public image. It came from consistency, strong songs, and the trust he built with country audiences. He was becoming a major star, but he still carried himself with the same restraint and seriousness that had always defined him. At the same time, his family life was also growing. In 1981, George and Norma welcomed their son, George Strait Jr., known as Bubba. So while his career was gaining speed, his responsibilities at home were growing too. That made this period especially important. He was not only learning how to handle success, he was also trying to remain present as a husband and father. Even as fame began changing the outside shape of his life, the center of it remained the same: family, responsibility, and staying grounded. And just as everything seemed to be coming together, tragedy arrived and changed George Strait's life forever. The day everything changed. June 25, 1986, became the day that divided George Strait's life into two parts: before and after. By that point, his career was rising fast. His name was growing across country music, and from the outside, his life seemed to be coming together. But everything changed when his daughter Jennifer was killed in a tragic car accident in San Marcos, Texas. She was only 13 years old. No amount of success, money, or public admiration could protect a family from that kind of loss. In one moment, the future they had imagined was shattered. The details of the crash made the tragedy even harder to bear. Jennifer had been riding in a Ford Mustang driven by a friend when the vehicle lost control, rolled over, and crashed. During the accident, Jennifer was partially ejected from the car and died instantly. Reports later noted that the people in the car were not wearing seat belts, a fact that only added another painful layer to what had already happened. For the Strait family, the exact details could never lessen the shock. Jennifer was gone, and the loss was immediate. brutal, and permanent. For George and Norma Strait, this was not simply a sad event in an otherwise successful life. It was the kind of heartbreak that changes everything inside a family. Jennifer had been their first child, and she had been part of their lives long before George became a major star. She belonged to the years when they were still young, still building a family, and still trying to make life work. Losing her meant losing a part of the foundation on which their entire life had been built. The grief inside the Strait household was enormous. Those close to the family described a period of deep sorrow and withdrawal as they tried to survive something no parent is ever prepared for. For George Strait personally, the tragedy marked a major turning point. Fame no longer mattered in the same way. Career success, chart positions, and public recognition suddenly felt small next to the reality of losing a daughter. From that point on, grief became a central part of his private life, even if he rarely spoke about it. It changed the way he dealt with the world and helped explain why he became even more protective of his family and personal life. What the public saw was a successful country singer. What they did not see was a father carrying unimaginable pain. And after that terrible day, George Strait made a choice that would shape the rest of his life in silence. The second life. After the death of his daughter Jennifer in 1986, George Strait made a decision that quietly changed the way he lived for the next several decades. He chose privacy over public sympathy. At a time when many public figures might have spoken openly, given emotional interviews, or allowed the media into their grief, Strait moved in the opposite direction. He largely stopped giving interviews and became even more guarded than before. This was not because he did not feel deeply. It was because the pain was too deep to put on display. For George Strait, silence became a way to protect himself and the people he loved. That decision created a clear boundary between his public image and his private life. George was still a major artist. He still recorded music, toured, and appeared on stage. Fans could still hear him sing, still buy the albums, and still watch his career grow. But when it came to his family and personal pain, he gave the public almost nothing. He refused to turn his home life into a public story. He did not invite cameras into his grief, and he did not use tragedy to create emotional attention. In an industry where artists are often expected to reveal everything, that choice stood out. He built a wall between fame and family, and he held that line very firmly. Grieving without an audience is a very different kind of struggle. It means carrying pain quietly, without explaining it to the world. For Strait, this private way of mourning seemed to become part of how he survived. Instead of speaking openly about loss, he processed it inwardly. He stayed close to his family, protected what remained of his home life, and let time pass without turning sorrow into public performance. That kind of restraint takes strength. It also shows how seriously he took the responsibility of guarding his family from further hurt. This is where the idea of George Strait's second life truly begins. Publicly, he remained the calm, steady, highly successful country star that millions admired. Privately, he was living with a grief that very few people fully saw. Fans heard the voice, but they did not hear the private silence behind it. They saw the concerts, the records, and the achievements, but not the sorrow that shaped the man singing those songs. That hidden life existed beside the public one, and most people never really understood how much of him lived there. And while George kept that pain mostly to himself, he soon found a quiet way to turn grief into something meaningful. Tragedy and purpose. In 1987, Just 1 year after the devastating loss of their daughter Jennifer, George and Norma Strait made a deeply personal decision. They founded the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation. It was not a public attempt to explain their grief, and it was not a way to bring attention to themselves. It was something much quieter and more meaningful. After losing Jennifer, they chose to create something in her name that could continue doing good in the lives of others. In that way, the foundation became more than a memorial. It became a way for their daughter's name to remain connected to care, kindness, and help. What makes the foundation especially powerful is how quietly it was built. George Strait never turned it into a major public campaign. He did not constantly speak about it in interviews or use it to shape a public image. That was very much in line with how he handled nearly every painful part of his personal life. He preferred action over explanation. The work of the foundation was carried out with very little noise, which made it feel even more sincere. It reflected the same values that had always guided him and Norma: privacy, humility, and responsibility. The foundation focused on helping children in need, which gave its mission a deeply personal meaning. It supported causes connected to healthcare, education, and stability for young people facing hardship. These were not random charitable interests. They were areas that touched directly on the vulnerability of children and families. By giving in this way, George and Norma were not only honoring Jennifer's memory, but also extending care to other children whose lives were marked by illness, difficulty, or uncertainty. Their private pain was being turned into quiet service. Over the years, the Jennifer Lynn Strait Foundation gave away millions of dollars to children's causes. That kind of long-term giving says a lot about the seriousness behind it. This was not a one-time response to tragedy. It became a lasting commitment. Jennifer's name, which could have remained tied only to heartbreak, instead became linked to compassion and hope. Through the work of the foundation, her memory continued to help people long after her life was cut short. For George Strait, this seemed to be one of the few ways grief became visible. Not through speeches, not through public emotion, but through steady and meaningful action. The foundation did not erase the loss, and it could never provide closure. But it gave that sorrow a direction. It allowed love for Jennifer to keep moving outward into the world in a quiet and lasting form. And while this private mission continued, George's public career kept growing bigger than ever. A personal loss. In April 2009, George Strait faced another deeply personal loss when his older brother, John Byron Strait, passed away on April 10th at the age of 58. For the public, it may have seemed like a brief and quiet moment in the life of a major country star. But for George, it was far more than that. This was not simply the loss of a family member in name. It was the loss of someone who had shared the earliest parts of his life long before fame, records, and packed arenas ever entered the picture. Buddy, as he was known, belonged to the part of George Strait's world that had existed before the public knew him. The bond between brothers is often shaped by shared experiences, and in George's and Buddy's case, those experiences began on the family farm in Texas. They grew up in the same hard-working environment, surrounded by cattle, chores, and the daily demands of rural life. They understood the same kind of upbringing because they lived it together. They knew the structure of their father's household, the pressure of responsibility, and the quiet toughness that came from growing up in a place where work came first. Those early years create a connection that is hard to replace, because the memories are not just remembered individually, they are carried together. That is what made Buddy's death so painful on a deeper level. George was not only losing a brother, he was losing one of the last living links to his earliest self. Buddy had known him before the stage, before the fame, and before the careful public image the world came to recognize. He was part of the original story, someone tied to George's childhood, family struggles, and the simple life that shaped him. When a person like that is gone, the loss can feel larger than one relationship. It can feel like part of your own past has disappeared with them. True to form, George Strait did not make this grief public in any dramatic way. He did not speak openly about the pain or turn it into a media moment. Instead, he handled it the way he had handled so many of life's hardest moments, quietly. Once again, he kept his sorrow private and close to the people who mattered most. That pattern had become a defining part of his life. He did not need an audience to make loss real. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more hidden stories behind the legends you thought you already knew.